FanDuel presents Sunday Victories. When your internet goes down while you're streaming the Super Bowl, but it's game on once you guess your neighbor's Wi-Fi password. It was password. You bet and you won in the game of life. Now, if you want to bet on the game of football, try FanDuel. New customers get a no-sweat first bet up to $3,000 back in free bets.
21 plus and present in Virginia. First online real money wager only. Refund issued as non-withdrawable free bets that expire in 14 days. Restrictions apply. See terms at sportsbook.fanduel.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER.
It's another busy week of tennis. I'm James Gray of iNews.co.uk and the iNewspaper. I've got tennis writer George Bellshaw and guesting today Abigail Johnson, our resident tennis commentator, to give us yet another profession on the podcast. This is Tennis Unfiltered.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff.
We've obviously got loads to get through today, but it would be remiss of me not to introduce Abigail to the podcast. Well, I think, Abigail, I'm trying to think if you've ever been on with us before, but maybe in a different incarnation, but it's certainly your first time on Tennis Unfiltered, given we've only been called that for about 3 weeks.
Yeah, this is actually my debut completely across the board, I think. So thank you for the welcome. And to Calvin, who may be listening from afar, I hope I keep your seat sufficiently warm here in your absence. I will try and live up to your lofty standards.
Well, you've got a lot more hair than Calvin. You're already winning on that one.
I was going to say, his head's unfortunately going to be cold because he didn't quite get the ratings we needed in for the cowboy hat.
Yeah, thank you to, there was certainly one request for Calvin to wear his cowboy hat on the plane to Texas. Abigail, if you don't know, Calvin was boasting about a lovely cowboy hat that he has, and we were trying to convince him to wear it in Texas.
I did hear that on the last episode, yeah. There we go. Okay.
But we've unfortunately not picked up. Well, we said if we got 5 5-star reviews that specifically mentioned it, then he would, but we unfortunately only got 2. Thank you to Smurfy924, who says, I absolutely love the show. Cannot wait for Mondays. Welcome back to America, Calvin. I wish I lived closer to Dallas. Good luck to your boys. Thanks, Smurfy, for that one. And also to Amy and Dude, who simply reviewed with 3 emojis, one of which was the cowboy emoji, the 100 and the round of applause. Insightful and entertaining tennis commentary. Thank you very much for those 2 5-star reviews this week. We really appreciate them when they come around. And I'm sorry that we didn't get 5 of them, and we could have made Calvin wear his cowboy hat on the plane, which would have been super embarrassing. But alas, I'm not going to be making similar bets for like wearing a hat with corks on it to fly to Australia and things, because, well, A, there isn't an emoji for that, and B, I desperately don't want to do that. And it would give you a lot more time to sort it out. Right, let's move on, because we've actually got quite a lot of tennis to go through. That was the first thing George said to me today. He said, actually, there's quite a lot going on this week, which is actually pretty much what George says to me every week before I hit record. There's actually quite a lot going on this week. Yes, George. It turns out tennis, quite busy. As Abigail well knows, and I well know from having actual jobs in tennis, and George just dips in and out when he feels is appropriate. We're going to start with Novak Djokovic, which must be a phrase I have said, I don't know, 40, 50 times in this podcast, but it seems like the obvious place to start, given what's been going on over the last 7 days. Craig Tiley came out and was very talkative, which is very much Craig Tiley's modus operandi. And he said, and I'm not going to say revealed for reasons that will become clear. He said Djokovic played the Australian Open with a 3-centimeter tear in his hamstring, that it was pretty incredible that he did it. That has been obviously questioned. We on this podcast openly questioned the Djokovic hamstring injury. Dr. Peter Larkins, who's the sort of resident big mouth doctor in Australia, he's someone who likes to talk and he's quite well qualified, says if it's a tear, it's possible, but it's very hard to imagine that it was a 3-centimeter tear. He said, I'm wondering if Craig is confusing signal of 3 centimeter in distance in an MRI hamstring. Signal can mean some inflammation or some swelling. It doesn't necessarily mean a tear. George, do we now have to accept that Novak Djokovic was actually injured, or are we still going to keep our tin hats on?
I think I've been the most neutral in this whole subject, to be fair.
No, I mean that's always true. Literally always true.
Yeah, I mean, I still don't believe he's got a 3 centimeter tear in his hamstring. And I've enjoyed this Peter Larkin's analysis around it. I think my favorite quote about this was like, if you take a piece of steak and cut a 3 centimeter hole in it, steak is muscle. And it's very hard to do the level of performance. I've not seen many steaks running around. I don't know what is.
I've never tried to get performance out of a sirloin, to be fair, other than slipping down my gullet at maximum speed. I don't know how helpful that is. Yeah, I mean it is pretty staggering. Look, the thing is that Calvin aside, and he will defend himself, I'm sure. I don't think any of us ever doubted there was something wrong with him, Abigail. There obviously was, because even the most Machiavellian, insane person wouldn't do what he did unless there was something, even very minor, wrong. But I don't know. I don't know where you stand on it. How injured do you think he was?
Yeah, it was an interesting journey because I was actually courtside during the match in which he picked up this injury. So it was the semi-final in Adelaide against Medvedev. And I felt like a terrible commentator at that point. Like, I was not on commentary for this match, but I was sat courtside to observe. And I only realized something had happened when I noticed that Djokovic was completely changing how he was contesting the whole match. So he was playing against Daniil Medvedev at this point, Adelaide semis, and he was suddenly charging up the court. And I was like, hang on a minute, he was not playing like this a few minutes ago, and it's not working out incredibly well for him. And then someone said he'd made this movement and he'd done something to his hamstring, and he was definitely making movements towards it and was not the same for the rest of that match. So I agree with what you said, that to a degree, there was clearly something wrong. I was commentating on his second round match at the Australian Open against Enzo Quacco, and I said to someone, I think I should have got Novak to pay half my flight back to the UK because I left during the men's final, so I couldn't commentate on it. And the only time I was on commentary for Djokovic during the Australian Open was the time he lost a set. So I think it was very beneficial to him that I was out of the country at that point. But again, that was a moment where it looked like it flared up, and he certainly seemed to be hampered by it, frustrated by it. And again, I thought, okay, well, something's causing him difficulty here. And it was a very strange situation because it went from that to him in his next match looking completely unfazed, moving well, being able to endure in these long rallies. And the conclusion that I personally came to, because I'm no doctor and I'm not Novak Djokovic, so I can't feel what he's feeling, is the same conclusion that I came to when I was reporting on one of Andy Murray's matches against, I think it might have been the Roberto Bautista Agut match, when he was like 35 hours into his tournament or whatever it was at that point. And I said to whoever was with me at the time, I can't remember who, I said, okay, so Andy Murray, he's moving great, isn't he? Yes, comes the agreement. No trouble moving side to side, no trouble investing in these rallies, correct? Yes, agreement comes. I said, so why are we still talking about the fact that he's got a metal hip? Like, how long do we talk about that for? At what point do we stop? I mean, for a moment and for a while, it's an incredible story. But I mean, if he's moving fine and if he's competing at this incredible level during the rallies, as he was in Australia, he'd worked himself to a great level of competitiveness. Why is it relevant? And I kind of took on that viewpoint with the whole Djokovic thing, in that looking at Murray and trying to analyze him by looking at what was going on during the points was really distracting, because we know what Andy Murray's like. He walk around at the back of the court, he's holding this, he's holding that, he's annoyed, he's yelling, and that, in terms of trying to analyze where the match was going, that was really off-putting, looking at Murray between the points compared to Murray during the points. And I just took on that same position with Djokovic, really, and that all I know and all I can see and all that I'm aware of it is what is happening during the points. And if he can move fine during the points, and if he can produce this outrageous level, that's ultimately all I care about as a commentator.
I was just going to say, I mean, Murray's quite an interesting comparison, really, in terms of I'm not going to try and defend Djokovic here because I don't think the injury is as bad as it is. But I think if you watch Murray play a lot and the attitude's kind of around Murray, or the way it's spoken about, there's so many times in matches where he's walking around like he looks like he's about to die or he's been shot, and he's kind of hobbling around, and you're thinking, oh no, here we go again. It's a tough day for Andy Murray. And then suddenly he's bolting.
Quite mediocre Andy Murray impression. What a surprise!
And then he's bolted around the court at 100 miles an hour the next point. And, no one really chases Murray that often, being like, oh, he's feigning injury, he's causing problems, he's trying to get an opponent's head. But there probably is a degree to that, to be honest. And it's not just a Djokovic thing, but Djokovic does also take it to a level that does wind people up. And, in years gone by, you've had Federer calling him out for his behavior on court. You've had, he's got quite a long rap sheet of other things that, maybe Murray gets off scot-free for. But I do sometimes think Novak can get a bit of over-treatment on some of these things, particularly think about like Nadal as well. Nadal's a long time over the years used to take the old time violation, go on about how terrible he's feeling, and then suddenly be absolutely just twatting through everyone at the French Open. You're like, well, that was a waste of everyone's time, wasn't it?
Yeah, he literally did it at Roland Garros last year, didn't he? And, I think what was clever about what he did at Roland Garros is before the tournament, he said, look, I've got a problem. My doctor's here all week. Can we just not talk about it until after the tournament? And obviously we still talked about it and relentlessly talked about it because it's a point of interest. But he didn't get asked about it again. And it wasn't like a Nadal-led thing. And I think what's clever about that from a sort of PR perspective is maybe he still wanted people to talk about it. But the best way to get anyone to not talk about something is to say, sorry, straight away, can I just say, can we not talk about that? Because as soon as they leave the room, that's all they're going to be talking about. So maybe that's the genius bit. Just on, Abigail, you're talking about on the court. And I think you're right to an extent that if he's playing bloody well, and he was, then does it really matter if he's, he might only have one leg, but if he's playing really well, maybe there's no point in talking about his absent leg. It kind of plays into a comment we got on YouTube this week from, and I think it says Almus. This is probably YouTube handles, they're impossible to pronounce. Joker is the only player who ever manages to compensate for aging by playing better and better every year. And no one told him to do it. He understood it and did it himself, about which he regularly informs us through interviews. Unlike him, Nadal's short bursts of good results depend on his muscles and strength and cannot compensate for muscles with his talent or different style. Roger tried, but he succeeded only in the absence of the best version of Joker, which brought him the last three majors. That's why we are seeing this phenomenon for the first time. Pure dominance in someone's 35th year. Quite aside from, there's some stuff in there that we can move past, which is the endless Roger, Rafa, Novak conversation. But what I did want to say, Abigail, is do you think we'll see more of this super aggressive, hard-hitting Djokovic that it felt like was an evolution at this tournament in terms of the way he was playing?
I mean, why not? If it's got him that level of success, it is what I'd start by saying. I also feel that there are elements of Djokovic that are underappreciated because he's so well-rounded. I think what, if anything, was highlighted in Australia, it was him as a complete package. Like even his weaknesses, like the overhead smash that used to be an opening, isn't really there anymore. He's just so complete. And because he's so thorough a player, it's very hard to pinpoint different elements of what makes Djokovic the champion that he is. And I think as well, because of the makeup of him as a player, and because there are such kind of obvious big hitters in the tour, I think Djokovic in general is hitting a harder ball than people can appreciate from the outside. I've spoken to players that have gone up against him for the first time and said, I was shocked at how low and fast his shots are traveling, which they've only been able to appreciate once they're on the other side of the net. I think the things that we're drawn to immediately with Djokovic are his flexibility, his endurance, his ability to use the pace that's coming at him. And there's just something about Djokovic that makes it actually hard to read from the outside how hard he is consistently hitting that ball. I don't think it's necessarily a new thing. Maybe it's been more apparent recently, and maybe there have been other factors, like we mentioned, the injury, that have led him to be a little bit more aggressive a little bit earlier than he might have been. But I definitely think that, yeah, he's not been given as much credit for that consistent heavy ball and the consistent rally pace that maybe other players are, because it's more of a standout feature of their game.
Yeah. The other thing you actually hear about him quite a lot is how every ball the opponent hits is slightly different, whether it be a slightly different spin, slightly different pace, slightly different length. Like, I think you're right, Abigail. It's particularly hard on TV, I think, to really appreciate kind of Djokovic's brilliance, because it's not as flashy as Roger, it's not as flashy as Nadal. And as you say, you know, when he springs out wide, that is quite flashy in the sense like, how the hell's this bloke got his legs in that position? But the key to success is like the forehand as well as much of the backhand. The backhand looks great because it's like harder to be that solid, but the forehand, he just controls beautifully. It's such a good shot. The angles he gets, the length, the consistency. It's horrible to play against, and I don't think you can truly appreciate the spins, the powers that's coming on the ball, unless you make it as obvious as Rafa does, where he's like winding up like a windmill every time, and you think, oh, you can tell there's a lot of spin on that ball because it's flying up. But yeah, Novak's subtlety probably does catch people out.
Subtlety is a perfect word to use, because it's almost hidden amongst everything else, because there are so many moving parts of Djokovic, and again, it's there are so many different things to highlight from his game that things like that can get lost in the thick of it. I think even the key elements, such as his serve, gets missed out because he's such a great returner. So everyone's talking about the return, when actually the serve has, you know, in that period a few years back when he was struggling, I felt like the serve was kind of seeing him through to an extent at that point. So he's a fascinating kind of a subject of discussion for me, Djokovic, because there's so much going on there, and he is the most complete player in the world now. I'm not just talking the best, I'm talking the most complete in terms of where's his weakness. That is, I think, what makes him so great. And it's still incredible to watch it play out.
It's a 3 centimeter weekness, just sort of midway through his hamstring. That's basically all we've got now. Moving on from Novak Djokovic. Now that we've had kind of a week or so post Australian Open, Abigail, you're obviously back in England now. George, you have never moved from your sofa. How do we Abigail, how do we reflect on the Australian Open? What do you think it will be remembered for? Because I always think with Grand Slams, there's stuff that happens during it, and you're like, that was amazing. But in 2 years' time, when I say 2023 Australian Open, what do you think you will remember it for most?
This is such a fascinating question, because I feel like I should remember it most for number 10 for Novak Djokovic, because that's something that is phenomenal. We're on what I consider the most neutral surface in tennis. Hard courts, that's supposed to be the leveler, the one that everyone can play on, that there's no advantage given to any person. And yet Novak Djokovic has just won 10 Grand Slam titles on this neutral surface on one of the biggest stages of the sport. Best of 5-set tennis, has never lost a final. I mean, it's an outrage. And I think it's played down because of what Rafael Nadal has been doing at Roland Garros. I mean, phenomenal, extraordinary stuff out there that I think has just meant that this achievement for Djokovic has been played down a little bit. Also, the field was different that Djokovic came through at this particular tournament. So as much as that is just an incredible accomplishment, I don't think in a couple of years' time, for me personally, that is what will stand out. The thing that will stand out for me is Grand Slam number 1 for Aryna Sabalenka, because I did not for a while think that Sabalenka was going to get a major. When she was first coming through, the firepower that she's capable of was breathtaking. And I thought, wow, for sure, this girl wins a major at some point in time. And then she got into that dangerous kind of Alina Svitolina, Karolina Pliskova stage where she was going deep at these big tournaments and not getting across the line. And I thought, okay, well, mentality is becoming a little bit of an issue. I don't really see much movement in your game. You can take the racket out of your opponent's hands, but at some point over 7 matches, you're going to come up against someone who's going to make you play enough balls so that you come undone, which is definitely what we saw happen against Leylah Fernandez at the US Open in 2021. She wiped her off the court for a set and a half, and then Fernandez, as she does, made some extra balls, fought her way through, played the match, and watched Sabalenka fall apart. But She has been a revelation to me, Sabalenka, the past month in terms of the balance that she's found in her game, little bit more depth, but also the confidence to keep producing with the big ground strokes as well. The stability she's uncovered in the serve. It is so rare as well for players that are not the dominant force in the sport to win a title pre-tournament and then come through and win the Grand Slam. So I had question marks about Sabalenka throughout the event, and she answered every single one emphatically. I think her attitude is exemplary. I think that's been the foundation for bringing it all together, and whether she goes on to win more Grand Slams or not, and I think that's a big possibility for her now. The 2023 Australian Open will always be Aryna Sabalenka's tournament for me. I think she really established herself as one to keep track of for the next few years.
Yeah, and it's as I said on previous podcasts, it's the first time I think in about 5 years that I've not said the phrase, I think this is the year Aryna Sabalenka wins a Grand Slam. So I don't even get I told you so right, infuriatingly. George, what do you think you'll remember this tournament for?
I think I broadly agree with Abigail there. I think the other slightly Djokovic thing I'm quite interested in now is a kind of broader point in men's tennis of how we've had Djokovic, Wimbledon, Alcaraz, US Open, Djokovic, Australian Open. I see that as I know Alcaraz wasn't at this tournament, so it feels almost redundant to say this in some ways, given it's a question about the Australian Open. But I think when you look back in history, you sometimes look at the span of Grand Slams that are going to happen. And I think that's the pattern we're going to be seeing one way or another over the next 2 or 3 years, and the real tussle between these guys. And feels like, when Novak was unable to play in Australia in the US Open last year and Alcaraz was flying in that first half of the season, everyone was starting to think, well, even if Novak's coming back anyway, this kid's really going to give him a lot of problems. And the response has been pretty darn emphatic from Novak to get back to number 1, pick up number 10. Alcaraz has been not the same player since the US Open for one reason or another. There's been injuries, and it's also perhaps a bit of a dip after the US Open, but I think most of us are thinking this guy's going to come back and be the guy who really pushes Novak hard. So I'm just quite excited about that and think this could be an interesting kind of footnote period in what could be a great rivalry for the next couple of years.
And what's kind of fascinating is that Djokovic and Alcaraz have never played on a hard court, and now the vaccine requirements in America are being lifted, I think, in May. So that'll take the handbrake off Novak Djokovic's hard court career. But up until this point, they've virtually been unable to play at big hard court tournaments because Alcaraz didn't break through until, beginning of 2022, end of 2021. And Djokovic has been banned from basically all the big hard court. I was just thinking, are there any currently big hard court tournaments on the men's tour outside the US? Because, there's one in Canada, obviously, but that's the same deal.
The other one that's been cancelled was obviously Shanghai.
Yeah, I was going to say, Shanghai. So there really aren't any. Unless he wants to play them at a 500, which it's quite hard to get 2 top 10 players in the same 500 draw and actually get them to play each other. Anyway, it will all not be relevant soon, but, Alcaraz is probably going to be at Indian Wells or Miami, and Djokovic won't be, so he might pick up 2 titles there, and then we're going to have this big, and then we've got the clay and then the grass. And then we might have this big kind of meeting of the minds in Cincinnati or something, or in wherever the Rogers Cup is this year. I can't keep track of which way round it is, but it leaves some intrigue, George. You're absolutely right. Let's move on to the WTA because it's been quite a cool week in the south of France, in Lyon. Alycia Parks won her first WTA title. She beat Caroline Garcia in the final. She moves up to number 51 in the world, having previously been a career high 70, even if she lost the final. It's a real breakthrough for this American, who I know a lot of people have been talking about a lot. Abigail, I'm sure she's someone you've had your eye on because, I've seen her play once or twice, and she's a great player to watch and quite a fun player as well. How big a moment is this for her?
Yeah, massive moment. I've been really impressed with Alycia. I actually saw her at one of the ITF events in the UK middle of last year during grass season. It was Surbiton, and she was playing doubles with a friend of mine. I also saw her on the singles court, and she was not close to her breakthrough yet, but her serve stood out an absolute mile. It was poles apart from everyone else that was there. And I at that point in time, I wondered, Is that going to hold up on the WTA? Is it going to look that stand out at a slightly higher level, or is it stand out because she's playing on a grass court right now as well, which is a much faster surface? And it turned out that it really was the big deal, the serve. And look, she's come through so quickly, broke the top 100 for the first time in December, and brilliant win to get it over Caroline Garcia in Lyon, top seed. And Garcia, by the way, was my pick to win the Australian Open. She's followed on really well from WTA finals, and for me, she's been one of my favorite WTA players to watch in recent months. She takes the ball up the line so confidently. She's got that great forecourt play, courtesy of all the doubles that she's been playing. But Parks, I've never seen. I'm going to say it's hard for me to remember a women's tennis match in recent times that has been as serve dominated as that Garcia Parks match at the weekend. I mean, there was one break point and no breaks of serve in the entire first set. So I don't think Garcia necessarily played a bad match there, even though she's just lost to a player ranked however many spots lower. And even though she would have been expected to win that match walking into it, Parks is just riding a wave of momentum at the moment. And won the big moments, won the tight moments because of the confidence that she has on that serve and the way she's able to set up the forehand behind it. I love how vocal she's been about her ambitions. She said at the beginning of this year, I want to be top 10 by the end of the year. And as I just said, she broke top 100 for the first time in December. So that's a massive statement to make. And I think that underlines the kind of confidence that we see from her when she's able to go for second serves, when she's able to rip the forehands the way she does. She's got a game that's founded on confidence. And I think the fact that she is willing to put that out there says a lot about how she is going to respond in the biggest moments and in the biggest matches. Like, she's ready to take it on. I do have concerns for her in that the backhand is so well, let's put this in a positive way. The forehand is miles better than the backhand by a long way, and she's been able to cover for the backhand because that serve is so potent, and because she's able to get so many forehands, and because Garcia in that final in Lyon won a lot of comprehensive service games serving into that Parks backhand, but ultimately it didn't matter because Parks had the big shots for the big moments in the tiebreak. So all of that work that Garcia did breaking down the backhand was undone. But I think the more that Parks is around, the more people are going to work out how to get into that two-handed backhand and draw the error. So she's got to capitalize on this wave of form that she's got going, because she's in, I'm not going to call it an Emma Raducanu situation, but there are similarities in that she's very fresh to that top WTA scene. People have not had time to analyze her game, to kind of work out her spots on serve, where she's going to go to in the big moments, and to work out how to get around the forehand, because the pace that she's able to generate is breathtaking. I think the longer that she's around, the more people are going to work out her tendencies, and the more players are going to be able to find the way to elements of her game that are more of a vulnerability. So for me, awesome. She's on the brink of the top 50. She's got to ride this wave, because I think the moment she comes off it, people are going to find ways to kind of tread her down. So it looks great for now. I would be very interested to see where she's at in 3 or 4 months' time.
Not really sure how to follow that gloriously detailed analysis. It was very good.
Yeah, we're not used to that kind of actual preparation on this show, Abigail. It's very much seat of the pants stuff.
She just fascinates me. I don't know.
The aspects I did want to kind of draw out as well that I kind of noticed watching her this weekend in the final. I was really impressed with the length of the ball, particularly on the forehand, as you said, Abigail. There's a real depth to how she's hitting as well. You know, you get a lot of kind of heavy hitters in the women's game, but sometimes that accuracy is not quite there, and it really is on that forehand. It's a pile driver of a shot. It's really good. And I was really impressed by her net play as well when she did come in. I think that's something that can, again, be really missing in a lot of kind of the top women's game. Some players, whether it be just not as comfortable coming forward, or they've got used to those kind of like back-to-back rallies from the baseline. But she seemed like someone who actually can come in behind it. And that's a big weapon when you've got a forehand like that, knowing when to come in behind that and having the hand skills to do it and the confidence. So I think there's a lot to be really excited about with her. And as you say, the serve's great, but it felt like there was quite a good all-court game coming with it as well. So there'll be improvements. And I think you said she wanted to crack the top 10. She is top 10 American now, which I think goes to speak to their depth as well at the minute. Pretty crazy.
I mean,
having
actually,
10
that is a
players,
serious
51.
achievement. Like, given how much depth they
It's
have, you're
massive.
right, George. That is significant. It's interesting as well because she is 51st in the world with 0 Grand Slam points. Like, she has never won a main draw match at a Grand Slam. She lost in the first round of qualifying at 3 out of 4 last year. She lost in the second round of qualifying, albeit she lost to Sarah Balic, who's one of the 1,800 Czech teenagers coming through women's tennis at the moment, who is very talented as well. But I think it's interesting to liken her to Emma Raducanu because, it's the same thing, isn't it? It's like no one's really seen enough of her to know exactly what to do with her. I think my concern is, she won those 2-1-2-5s at the end of last year. She's obviously won this all indoors, which is going to suit her game style quite significantly. We're now
True.
obviously she's going to go and play a lot of. She'll play the Sunshine Swing, and then on the hard courts we'll see how that goes, and then she's going to go onto the clay, which won't suit her at all. I'm not sure her record on that surface, but I can't imagine it's tremendous.
I think they're all really good points, and it's going to be very interesting to see her under a different microscope there. I think on the other side, what she's actually got going for her there, as alluded to, is lack of pressure. She's essentially got very little to defend and everything to gain over the next few months. And some of her weapons, she's not the most cookie-cutter player for a clay court, but a lot of those weapons are transferable. I mentioned the weakness of the backhand in comparison to the forehand, but what she needs on that backhand is time to set up for it. She'll get that on a clay court. Yeah, she'll have to play more backhands and more shots in general, which is not ideal for her. But there are different, I guess, ways of looking at it. She's made no secret of the way she's looked up to Serena Williams. Serena really warmed up to a clay court in the latter stages of her career, appreciated the little bit more time that she had on the surface, and was able to still utilize the serve as well. So I'm not calling Parks to make big moves on the clay this season. I'm not sure that she will. I don't think that she will, but I think that there's enough of an open canvas for her across the rest of the year to think that, I don't think top 10 is such an outrageous shout for her at all. I think she can walk the walk as well as talk the talk, I think.
Yeah. I mean, and just kind of a broader point on her record recently. I mean, if you go back through the year, apart from the last 2 months, it wasn't anything to really write home about. So, the fact she didn't have that many wins on clay from where she was 8 months ago compared to now feels like a kind of different player, given that kind of wave of confidence she's riding. So have to wait and see. But yeah, another exciting young talent, youngish. Do we count her as young? 22? That's young, isn't it?
Well, it's not really young on the WTA,
getting
is it?
Old.
I'm not convinced.
Yeah.
I mean, also,
no, it's a good point. It's a good point. I don't know. I still, and 22 is young. I think when you hit 23, then you're kind of getting towards the older. I think 22 and under, you can call that young.
all right,
Because
okay.
you think college as well, so many more players are going the college route, and then they come out around that time. So I think that kind of helps us to refer to 22 and below as slightly younger.
George, you better have a really.
I was going to say, as men in our 30s, we consider anything in the 20s very young, don't we, James?
I think 31 and even 32, which I am soon to be, extremely young. When we come back, we'll perform a quick substitution. Calvin Betton will be live from Texas. Abigail's going to go and do much more with her life than talk to us about tennis. And we will talk about Nick Kyrgios, Alexander Zverev, Dan Evans, and the Davis Cup. Welcome back to Tennis Unfiltered with me, James Gray of iNews.co.uk, the tennis writer George Bellshaw, and in for Abigail Johnson, we've got our resident. I say resident, he's not in the UK, but given that this is, I'll tell you what, this is a first. This is a 3-continent podcast now, because we've got me out in Australia, George back in the UK, and Calvin Betton live and exclusive from Texas. Calvin, how are you getting on?
Yeah, all good, all good. I haven't seen much of the place because the tennis is right next to the hotel. So other than the drive from the airport, basically just past the most dangerous. You basically have to walk across a motorway to get there, though. So,
Oh, fun.
Yeah. So yeah, it's only about 50 meters, but it can take about 3/4 of an hour to get there if there's no cars.
Excellent. Now, from reports I've received, there's been multiple instances of racket-related shenanigans in Team Cash and Patton. Would you like to expand on any of them?
Yeah, well, Henry couldn't land. He couldn't take his initial flight because of he was flying from Denver, where his girlfriend lives. He couldn't take his initial flight because of the extreme weather in Dallas on that day. There was freezing rain on that day, apparently. And then we got there the day after that, and Julian's rackets got lost on the flight. They got put on a later flight, so they did arrive later that day, but late on at night, about 9 o'clock at night, they landed. So
panicky. And have you got a racket, Calvin?
Well, that's the story. I've got some new rackets coming because yesterday in practice, or the day before yesterday in practice, I might have got hit in the private parts with a ball, and in a fit of anger, I smashed my racket.
Now, do coaches get code violations? Is there some sort of fine? Did you have to do press-ups for the team?
Not as far as I know, no. But although I think actually smashing my racket into the practice court probably improved the practice court, because it's one of the worst ones I've ever seen.
Excellent. The joys of 250s, eh? Great. Okay. Well, I'm glad you're intact, even if your racket frames aren't, and I'm glad that Yonex are so good to look after you while you're out there. Right, let's move on, shall we? I think we should start with the questions. We've had quite a full mailbag this week, so I've got a couple of good questions from Toby Hall on Twitter and from Prabesh in Nepal on email. Remember, if you want to get in touch, you can. As always, we're on Twitter at unfilteredtennis, or you can email us, tennisunfiltered@gmail.com. You can also DM us on Instagram, Tennis Unfiltered Pod. You can follow us on many different social media, and I try and check all of them as often as possible. So if you've got a question for the pod, you've really no excuse not to ask it. And that's what Toby Hall has done. He tweeted us to say, do you think Sabalenka and Rybakina can challenge Swiatek for number one, or is their heavy hitting too court dependent and not replicable across the calendar? George, what do you reckon? Can Rybakina and Sabalenka challenge for number one?
I'd back Sabalenka a lot more than Rybakina. I mean, I'd still be surprised, I guess, but given Sabalenka has been very, very, very consistent outside of the slams, if she starts adding big, deep slam runs and wins, then she's going to be pretty close, because she's basically been going without that for a fair while, bar the odd kind of semi-final. So, Rybakina, we've not really seen the consistency yet. And I've alluded to it a little bit the last few weeks. There's still a couple of question marks about where Swiatek's at the minute. Is she going to be the dominant force we saw last season? Will she be able to maintain that consistency, or are people going to fancy her? That invincibility, as soon as you pierce it, can be tough to get back. So, yeah, it'll be certainly more interesting than it was last season. I think the race for number one, but I think I'd be sticking my eggs in the Swiatek basket still at the moment.
Calvin, Swiatek, I think, is guaranteed number one now until the middle of April at least. But after that, can you see either of those two women putting together some consistent tennis to challenge her?
I think in terms of how the rankings work, and because she's got so much to defend, it's possible that one of them, as George says, probably more likely Sabalenka, but one of them could challenge getting to number one in the rankings. I still think we'll see that Swiatek remains the best player in the world overall in terms of consistency. But it wouldn't surprise me if either of those players get wins against her, and the ranking may swap around that time. Well, it could be around any time from April until, I guess, now, really, because she's just got so much to defend. She can't really extend her lead because she won pretty much everything other than Wimbledon, didn't she?
We are now getting to the point where this is where her winning run started last year. So every match she loses in the next 3 months is going to cost her points, and she's at 10,400 at the moment, and it's almost impossible for her to make that total go up. So yeah, it's a good point. Let's move on, because Pravesh from Nepal sent us an email, tennisunfiltered@gmail.com, with a question that we've kind of skirted around quite a lot, and I know people get really excited about, and me as a one-hander aficionado particularly. Pravesh writes, is one-handed backhand going to die in the next 10 to 20 years? Tsitsipas is the highest-ranked one-hander on both tours. Jabeur is the only one I can think of in the women's tour, and both at limited. I don't think Jabeur has a one-handed backhand. She once hit one at Wimbledon, and she hits a lot of slices, but I don't think we would technically call her a one-handed backhand. But anyway, move on. Players like Shapovalov, Musetti all seem inconsistent. Is it because they don't know how to perfect a one-hander and are just bad in general, or is it just because it's a huge liability as a shot? If it's the latter, should coaches at junior level stop teaching it completely? Why handicap someone? And do you think, guys, there is any way to evolve one-hander so they can be brought back into fashion? On the female side, I can't even name one noteworthy player that is a proper one-hander. Long question, but cheers, guys. Love the show. Well, just to name the women who do hit one-handers, there are 5 in the top 200. Tatiana Maria, who actually switched from a two-hander mid-career, Victoria Golubic, Diane Parry, the amazing Fernanda Contreras Gomez, who's a fabulous just woman and takes notes and reads notes on court and stuff, and I love that. And Jessica Ponche from France. Calvin, you're the technical expert here, so maybe there's some stuff to look at here. Is the one-hander intrinsically bad? Should coaches still teach it at junior level?
You still get the odd one who you see hitting it. It's not something I'd particularly do unless you've got somebody who has a real feel for it. But even then, it's so difficult with the way that the game's going in terms of power to be able to. One, you're giving away, you can't hit the ball as hard with a one-hander, obviously. And 2, you can't withstand as much power with only one hand on it in defence, which makes it difficult. I can't think of a junior player or a young player that's coming through that has a real great one-hander. We get this thing like, actually, I was watching Shapovalov today because he's playing in Dallas, and I said to one of the lads, Shapovalov's backhand is up there as up there towards the top of the charts of shots that look great but aren't very good. And that's what you tend to get with one-handers. They do look lovely. They look like we think tennis shots should look, and exemplified by Federer, who's had a lovely shot. But to be honest, in terms of like shots, it's even in the last 15 years, one-handers that you would say are great shots, not great one-handers, but great shots, you'd probably say Gasquet's backhand and Stan Wawrinka's backhand, although Stan Wawrinka's forehand was actually way better than his backhand. I don't think we'll see them fade. I don't think we'll see them completely disappear, but I'd be surprised if we get more than 10% of them in the top 100 in the men's and, like you say, 5% in the women's.
I think the name I was thinking about when seeing this question, you'll both be shocked to hear, was Dominic Thiem. But in all seriousness, I mean, I did think Thiem's backhand was very, very good, but what actually was as big a part of how it became good was how good his movement was to get out there and defend it, and particularly on the clay. Like, it was a good shot because of everything, the whole package that he has. Whereas like a Tsitsipas, I don't think he necessarily has the whole package quite that way. But even, Wawrinka's backhand was amazing when he connected with it, but you still felt in some matches that he could just get kind of pushed down quite easily as well. I mean, it is definitely a tough shot, but I think Thiem's backhand was pretty good as well, and I'd have that as kind of quite high.
I'd agree. What I would say though about Thiem and Wawrinka is where they're quite unique, as they were both huge physical guys, upper body, like massive upper body strength. They were probably, I'd say, maybe along with Nadal, like the biggest in terms of like powerfully big. I don't mean in terms of height or weight, but the bulkier guys on tour were Stan Wawrinka and Dominic Thiem, you would say, wouldn't you, for that period, which helps being able to hit a one-hander.
The other thing that sort of occurred to me in this conversation as well is how I know Gasquet's had good results as well, but he almost feels like a slightly different generation. But Federer feels potentially like the last sort of most successful, most suited one-handed player to play on the grass. I mean, the rest of them have been pretty poor on the grass and don't seem that well suited to it as a shot.
Dimitrov was all right on the grass.
Yeah, but I'm considering him as part of Federer. That's maybe a bit harsh. But like Wawrinka, Thiem, Tsitsipas, you would never really kind of have them down to win Wimbledon. But I still think it's a very effective shot on the clay by comparison. I think the slightly kind of higher bounce allows you a bit more time to kind of come up over it, and that is where it is more of an effective shot. So it's kind of no surprise to me that those three are more successful there than the grass, where the slice one-handed backhand that Federer was so good at doesn't really feel like it's made the transition to a lot of other one-handed backhanders.
I was just going to say that actually, George. I think it's not necessarily that their backhands don't hold up. Their drive backhands don't hold up. It's that neither of them have particularly great slices. Not that they're bad slicers, but Thiem and Wawrinka, their slices aren't in the same league as you would say Federer's was, and certainly not like someone like Dan Evans, who mixes up probably 50-50, but probably goes more slice than drive, actually. He's probably about 60-40, if not more than that. But he has he's pretty decent on grass because he uses the slice. It's a nice slice backhand. And similarly, like from the era before that, I guess Tim Henman probably had the best slice backhand maybe of the last 20 years. And that's why he was so successful on the grass. So I would say it's less that their one-handers aren't any good on the grass. It's more that they don't have the variation of the slice.
Yeah. And again, I sort of made that point about Tsitsipas last week. I do slightly worry that the slice is going out of the one-handed game. And I do, in some ways, not for everyone, but for a lot of these young players who've been watching Federer in that kind of later transition, I do wonder if that's going to be a bit of an interesting theme now, that maybe that the people are overemphasizing the drive that looks good, but actually losing quite a crucial part of what made Federer so good, which was that slice backhand.
Well, Pravesh, I hope that answers your question. I'm sorry that it's not more about how much we're going to see of the one-handed backhand over the next 10 to 20 years. I was just going through, actually, the list. Tennis Abstract have a really useful list of all the highest-ranked single backhands in tennis. Thank you, Jeff, as always, because Tennis Abstract is just the best website in the world. I can't find anyone in the top 500 born after the year 2000 with a one-handed backhand. There are a couple of 99s and 98. Matteo Martino from France, Gianmarco Moroni from Italy, and another Italian, Giovanni Fonio, all of whom claim to have one-handed backhands, but no one who is fighting their way up, and they're all sort of between 300 and 400, to be honest. So no one coming through, I'm afraid, George.
Just as a short defence, because it feels like we've been a bit negative. I mean, we have just had a one-handed backhander in the Australian Open final, so it certainly doesn't initially limit you to what, the sky being the limit. Teams won one recently. Wawrinka's won one in the not too distant past, and Dimitrov and Gasquet were both brilliant players as well. So, I wouldn't necessarily have such a downer that it's over, even though I kind of accept that the two-handers probably more favourable.
Yeah. It's interesting, isn't it? There's so much variety of backhands going around at the moment. Like, when you actually think about the kind of the top, I don't know. Or just looking at the quarterfinals, for example, the Australian Open, I feel like there's lots of different types of backhands. Anyway, we could talk about forehands and backhands, but in the words of Billie Jean King, forehands and backhands, people don't want to read about that. I assume people don't want to listen about it as well. We've talked lots about backhands. And we've got to move on to some quite serious stuff that's been going on over the last week, I suppose. Nick Kyrgios entered a guilty plea to the charge of common assault in an Australian court. it was said, and he admitted that he pushed his then girlfriend Chiara Passari onto the pavement during an argument, but was spared a criminal record or a sentence, which I'm told in Australia is not an uncommon reaction to a minor offence for someone with a clean record. Magistrate Beth Kelly, who was presiding over the case, called the incident, quote, a single act of stupidity or frustration. She also stated that he was, quote, a young man trying to extricate himself from a heightened emotional situation. She said, you acted in the heat of the moment. I'm dealing with you in the same way I would deal with any young man in this court. You're a young man who happens to hit a tennis ball particularly well. It should also be noted that Kyrgios' lawyers sought to have the charge dismissed on mental health grounds, and that a psychologist gave evidence, both written and by phone, in court that he was in not a mental health crisis, but in a poor way in terms of mental health at the time. The magistrate, though, rejected the submission that the charge should be dismissed on mental health grounds. Kyrgios' statement afterwards said, I respect today's ruling and I'm grateful to the court for dismissing the charges without conviction. I was not in a good place when this took place. I reacted to a difficult situation in a way I deeply regret. I know it wasn't okay. I'm sincerely sorry for the hurt I caused. Mental health is tough. Life can seem overwhelming. But I found that getting help and working on myself has helped me to feel better and to be better. George, the Australian courts have found Nick Kyrgios guilty because he pled guilty. But as I said, as happens in Australia, with what is considered minor offences, and common assault is the sort of most minor of assault charges, there is no criminal record and no sentence. Should the ATP Tour now conduct their own investigation and dish out their own punishment?
I think they probably should, as much as anything, because there's been a lot of pretty poor water going under the bridge the last few years that they've claimed they can't do anything about until they see a bit of legal evidence going in one direction. I think it sends out a pretty poor message if you then don't stand by that, even though I think the severity of this, while I'm not condoning it, isn't in the same league as what Zverev and Basilashvili, for example, have been facing in terms of allegations, I would say. But that's not to excuse it and not to say it was serious enough to go to court and serious enough to bring the game into disrepute. And, frankly, as, men sat here, there are things, it's not being dealt with well at any level of the court system across the world, this sort of kind of male on woman violence and domestic violence as a whole. So I think I think it would be great if the ATP did take a stand, to be honest, and put a ban in and certainly a fine, and make a bit of a statement on it, because frankly a lot of other sports that have been dealing with this haven't really managed to do that, and I think the message would be quite good, if nothing else.
It's not the only domestic abuse case that has resolved this week in tennis. You alluded to Alexander Zverev there. George, everyone, and if they're not, then they should go and read them. They are there to be read as long as you're not in Germany. The allegations made by Alycia Sharipova regarding Alexander Zverev. She claimed that he assaulted her at multiple tennis events. Some quite harrowing stories. The investigation by the ATP that was given to investigators called the Lake Forest Group, who are an independent group. That investigation has concluded with no further action necessary. It was an exhaustive process, quote, a lack of reliable evidence and eyewitness reports, in addition to conflicting statements by Sharipova, Zverev and other interviewees. The investigation was unable to substantiate the allegations of abuse or determine that the violations of ATP's on-site offences or player major offences rules took place. Calvin, I think this is much more difficult because we've had what was, submitted into the public domain by Sharipova through those two interviews that Ben Rothenberg conducted. We are led to believe it's been a rigorous process, and there has been obviously a couple of legal cases, one in Germany and one in Russia, which Zverev alluded to in his statement, which in the interest of fairness I should actually read, I realise. He says, from the beginning, I have maintained my innocence and denied the baseless allegations against me. I welcomed and fully cooperated with the ATP's investigation. I'm grateful for the organisation's time and attention in this matter. The decision marks a third neutral third-party arbiter who has reviewed all relevant information and made a clear, informed decision on this matter in my favour. In addition to the ATP's independent investigation, I've also initiated court proceedings in Germany and Russia, both of which I have won. I'm grateful that this is finally resolved. My priority is now recovering from injury and concentrating on what I love the most in this world, tennis. I want to thank my friends, family and fans for their ongoing support. We've followed the long and difficult process and justice has prevailed. There's been no comment from Alycia Parks on the ruling as yet. Calvin, this is clearly very difficult, but it seems to me startling that it's taken the ATP this long to come to this conclusion when the criminal case regarding Nick Kyrgios has taken less time and you would think would be more bureaucratic and more exhausting. Surely this should have been done with a much greater sense of urgency in order to kind of quash any allegations, if indeed they were false, which the investigation claims they were.
Yeah, it's not been a great week for sport, has it, with this type of thing? With there isn't enough evidence being the pertinent phrase across tennis and football. And it shows that we're not really moving forward as a society on that. The ATP have they've made a mess of this one, I think. And then it felt from the start they were trying to find a way of getting this end result and what would be the quickest way of doing it. We knew this from the start. This is the same thing that we always come across with these kind of crimes. Is that how can you have eyewitness evidence? Like, what's the likelihood of ever having that? And if that's the case, then there'll be zero conviction. Well, not zero. There'll be very, very, very few convictions ever for sexual assault. If the bottom line of it is you need eyewitnesses, basically. Yeah. So I don't get what they didn't have that at the start. So why drag it on for this long? They knew that, but at some stage you're going to have to start believing the victims. You're going to have to start believing the women, rather than just going, "Oh, there's no evidence."
And it's interesting. I read a column in the Independent by Katie Edwards, that the headline was "Nick Kyrgios' apology isn't worth a thing." Subject: at least Kyrgios is feeling better. Has anyone asked Chiara Passari how she's doing? Thought not. It's true that the rigmaroles of the process inevitably mean that the focus is very much on the accused, and rightly to an extent, not on the accuser, but there is an element to which, Kyrgios turned up to court in crutches, and the mental health submission, which was trying to get the charge dismissed, which was rejected. The lawyers are doing whatever they can. That this is kind of the very foundation of the legal justice system to give their client the best go that they can. But I think it's important to look at that Kyrgios case, for example, and say, I think this sends a bit of a message that if it's a one-off thing and you lose control in the heat of the moment, it's okay. And I'm not comfortable with that. And that's kind of what this column echoes as well. And like I said, Nick Kyrgios has been convicted of a low end of assault, but not to put any sanction on that, I think is quite troubling.
Also, this is what concerns me about when people start talking about mental health, and I'm not dismissing mental health at all. There are people who do suffer from it badly, but it feels now like it's becoming almost a way out for certain things. The stuff what he said about I wasn't in a good place. Who's ever in a good place when they do that? We could just write that. Who's ever in a good place when they start pushing their girlfriend over? You never are, and it just feels like I do feel like as a society we're getting to a place now where the first port of call is right. Let's go mental health, and there seems that there is a lot of sympathy with that, and that I think is dismissive of people who genuinely do have mental health issues. Nick, I've said before, Nick Kyrgios pulls the mental health one out regularly. Not enjoying playing tennis is not suffering from mental illness. That's not the same thing.
Yeah. And it is relevant that the judge dismissed that application that the charge should be thrown out on those grounds, despite the evidence of a psychiatrist and everything that was placed into evidence. So I think to that extent the mental health defence didn't stand up, and I think that's important as well. And that is not to say that Nick Kyrgios hasn't had serious mental health issues in the past, and that's not to say that he doesn't now, albeit everything that has been said during the course of this trial is that he's doing much better and that his mental health is in a much better place. And as you say, Calvin, I think it's a really good point. Who is in a good place when you do those things? It doesn't excuse it. Like, even if you're, completely out of your mind and on a psychotic break, that doesn't mean that if you commit a crime, it is excused. It might mitigate the sentence, but it doesn't mean that it's an okay thing to do. You might end up in a secure facility rather than jail. You might end up in a hospital rather than a prison, but you would still receive some kind of sanction over that. And that's where I find the discomfort that, someone has been found guilty of a crime against a woman who trusted him and hasn't got anything sanctioned against him. I'm struggling with that, to be honest, George.
Yeah, I think so. And again, this is where, it would be good for the ATP really to make that statement, at least. I think we touched upon this before, that legal processes are not doing very well on this front in anywhere in the world for a multitude of reasons. But the ATP really, for me, has to act from that perspective, in the sense that he's absolutely brought the sport into disrepute. If they want to find a open quotation marks legal basis for it, there's no question about that being found guilty of this sort of thing should do that. And it's just someone needs to start actually punishing people and putting some markers down in this field. It's just not really good enough. And you're absolutely right to flag that sort of Colin James as well, because this sort of thing is totally played in the field of Kyrgios, and we're all kind of talking about him. But it must be an absolutely horrible thing, actually, really thinking further about it, to someone you love and trust who's physically much stronger than you, even if it's not the world's most terrifying physical crime, actually that mental psychological fear of that kind of relationship that it instills must be a really damaging and horrible thing that will have taken her a while to get over, and if she's over it at all. So I think the consequences should certainly extend to him for a period of time.
And I wanted to bring in Colin in as well, because I think it's important to have a female voice on this. I appreciate we're a podcast of predominantly three men, and I wanted to talk with Abigail about that as well, but she's a tennis commentator and watched a lot of tennis, and I wanted to get her expertise in the limited time we had on that as well. And I think probably she would echo quite a lot of what was being said. I think it's particularly important to note that it's really important for tennis's diversity that it takes seriously things like this. It needs to send a message to the world that says we're not a sport that allows people who commit crimes against women to come back. And like I said, that doesn't legally apply to Alexander Zverev. It does apply in a small way to Nicholas Kyrgios, but it's the same across all sport. You need to send a message that says we are not a group of people who tolerates this kind of thing.
I think the thing what's really disappointed me over the last week, both with Kyrgios and Zverev, and the other thing that we were alluding to is Mason Greenwood, is the number of people I've seen on social media defending those people entirely on the basis that they're their favourite sports people, for nothing else. And it's not based on anything else other than, well, they haven't done it. We need to support them now, and we told you so, and this kind of thing. And I just find that staggering from actual human beings, that we can be so brazen and wrong in that way.
And partisan, and quite obviously partisan,
And not so relevant to the Kyrgios case, but quite often people take a not guilty verdict or whatever as a total defiance of innocence, where it just simply means there wasn't enough evidence sometimes, and that feels true in a lot of these cases.
I don't know if they still have it, but they used to have a verdict in Scotland called not proven. So a jury could return 3 different verdicts: guilty, not guilty, and not proven. And I always thought it was such a waste of... I mean, it was sort of great from a journalistic perspective because you could report it and say it would give you a bit more freedom when reporting, but it's like, well, we think you did it, but we can't prove it. It's like, I don't know who that verdict really helps at all, but anyway, Scottish law is a very complicated thing and not, I think, less efficient than English law. But anyway, this is not the Law Unfiltered podcast because that's virtually impossible to do. Let's move on. We don't like talking about this stuff, but it's important to talk about it. And it always happens when we talk about this really big stuff, and then we have to joke about Dan Evans getting to play doubles in the Davis Cup, and it feels completely churlish. But at some point, you have to make the step, and I assure you, it's not for wanting to denigrate what we've been talking about. But Dan Evans finally got a game of Davis Cup doubles, and he won. God damn it, against Farah and Cabal in Colombia. I mean, which is. In Colombia in February on clay is the ultimate wet Wednesday night in Stoke of Davis Cup tennis. It was a massively important match. Evans and Skupski won in straight sets. Evans had actually lost in a really dramatic singles match. Cam Norrie then made it 1-1. The doubles match made it 2-1 and Norrie sealed it for a 3-1 victory. George, I mean, to say what you like about Evo, he's put his money where his mouth is.
Yeah, absolutely. And to be fair to Dan, I mean, it's not like he's not gone out and proven it on the doubles tour before. I think sometimes the debate has been a little bit like, oh, well, we've got, world number 1 doubles player. Why would a chippy singles player be getting involved? But him and Skupski have proven themselves to be a good pair together and had better doubles results than the Murray's really had over the last year or so. So he's got that case with him on form. He's gonna cause Leon a bit of a problem actually, because it really would have worked in some ways in Smith's favour. Not that I'd say he wants him to lose, but in terms of kind of nipping this thing in the bud, had Evans gone there and just lost quite comfortably, that now it's going to be a really pretty tough choice because Salisbury was talking about kind of having his back problems at the minute, but is still right up there with the world's best doubles players. Skupski's playing really well, and Skupski seems to play best with Evans. And there's maybe a few question marks over the Salisbury-Murray partnership. So, yeah, selection headache, but I suppose a nice problem to have, as they say in sports cliches.
In rowing, they call it a seat race, where you just have the same crew and then you swap people in and out. And I think we should have Murray and Salisbury versus Evans and Skupski in a televised practice match 2 days before the Davis Cup finals. Full crowd, aggro, the whole thing. I think that'd be great. And Evo would love it, I'm sure. Calvin, you obviously know Dan pretty well, and you know how competitive he is and how much it will mean to him that he's gone and won that, and also to win a tie away from home. I mean, what an endorsement of the home and away format. Yeah,
I mean, look, Dan's an excellent doubles player. He's underranked at what his ranking is, and he certainly warrants his place he should have played already. It's amazing that he hadn't played a doubles match. I will say it's a bit disconcerting. I'm seeing everybody going on about Dan Evans won his doubles match. It's all I heard. It's all I've heard since then. The guy he played with is not bad. He's got 1 next to his name on the world doubles rankings. That's not a bad one. Let's talk about that as well. I think that is important. It was a good win. I will say I think Farah and Cabal are not what they were. They're certainly on the trajectory down. And I think I don't know which one it is very underpowered now. But in those conditions, it was a good, really good win, really strong win. It's strange if you said that that Britain had won 3-1, you would think it was that they'd probably lost the doubles and won all the singles, wouldn't you? But it wasn't. Evo actually lost one of the singles, so But it looked at
doubles.
I didn't see loads of it. I saw snippets of the doubles. It looked like it was a great atmosphere. Again, I do love the home and away ties. It's my preference. The problem is, if you look at Davis Cup, I was just thinking about this morning. right since I've been watching tennis, been a tennis fan, which I guess, or knowing enough about tennis, which is, I guess, from the early mid-90s, I can't think of any times where actually the two best countries have played each other in the Davis Cup final. We've had great Davis Cup finals, but not where you would say, right, they're the two best countries. And that's because with the home and away ties and that kind of thing, players just don't want to turn out in them a lot of the times. And it just, what will normally happen will be a team can get their best team out once, or 1 year, and that's it. You know, I think Djokovic won it with Serbia 1 year because they got everyone out. Nadal's won it a few times. Has Federer won it? Federer and Wawrinka win it? They won Davis Cup? Yeah.
Yeah, there's a nod.
Yeah. Britain have obviously won it, so Murray's got his one in there. But but you look at that, like Murray beat Belgium. Britain beat Belgium in the final when they won it. Like Belgium were far from the second best country ever. And I think but again, it is great. It's a great event. I wonder whether the format that they did the other day was maybe the route back for that, where it's 2 days. 2 days, best of three. I think that fitted better with the doubles in the middle. Better than that nonsense at the ATP Cup where the doubles were still last, which meant you basically hardly ever going to get a live doubles rubber. But I thought that worked really well. The two matches on the Friday, one doubles, and then two singles on the Saturday.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned us not really giving Skupski the kind of shout out there, Calvin, but there was a bit of a period, wasn't there, when he kind of went with Jamie Murray straight after kind of Bruno, and they were hoping that was going to be a partnership that works out, and it didn't quite pan out the way it did. It kind of felt at the time a little bit, and I'm not sure this is actually true in terms of what people thought, but it felt a little bit like, Skupski had stepped up and maybe not quite made it, in the inverted commas, with someone has been as successful as Jamie Murray, and felt like he was kind of binned off a bit in some ways. And he's really, really gone from strength to strength since that. And I think it's testament to his character, because that he played with his brother, of course, for a long time and made that step up. Didn't quite happen, and now he's absolutely flying out there. And great endorsement for Louis and Co. back in Britain HQ as well.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth remembering that, and I haven't got the stats in front of me, but Neil is still a bit of a Davis Cup rookie. Like he hasn't played many Davis Cup matches. I think you probably count it on one hand the number of actual Davis Cup matches he's played, which he's 33 and he's been around the block plenty of times. But I think Davis Cup, especially for the doubles guys who, even more so than singles guys, don't play in front of big crowds very often, it's a whole, and it's a different type of crowd anyway, it's a whole different level of pressure to go out. And Evo talks about it a lot, how pressurized it is and how great it is to represent your country, but not everyone thrives under that kind of environment, and it takes some getting used to. We've seen it with Joe. I don't think Joe's played his best tennis in Davis Cup by any stretch. And it has taken time for people to adjust. So a massive result for him. I really enjoyed watching the video when they were celebrating after match point in the Norrie match, and everyone, like all the players, all the physios, all the coaches, were on the court sort of jumping around in a circle. And just before the video cuts off, I just hear someone say, "We're getting on it, Jack!" And I then on Dejan Vojnovic's Instagram this morning, who's Jack's fitness trainer, saw a picture of all the players in a bar in Bogota. And I don't want to cast any aspersions on Jack Draper's character, and he more than deserves a beer, I'm sure. But everyone looked like they'd had a really good night, put it that way. I'll try and find the photo. It made me laugh. Let's move on. We were already going long, but I think we're going to go long just because that's what happens when we get other people on the podcast. Because I want to talk about Australian Open TV ratings, which caused quite a fuss on Twitter this week. The men's final in the US pulled the lowest numbers for at least a decade, according to the Sports Business Journal. The domestic Australian numbers were a significant dip on last year as well, albeit that there was some expectation of that because of the strong Australian interest in the back end of the second week last year. but the men's final nevertheless didn't have an Australian in it and still pulled better numbers. An absence of big matches, the foregone conclusion of the final. Someone blamed me for breaking the Serjan Djokovic story and suggesting that fewer people in the US watched the match because of that, which is obviously bollocks, and actually technically I didn't break it anyway, but let's move on. Don't want to get stuck in that too much. George, what do you think? I mean, is this just... There's been lots of lowest finals for a decade over the last couple of years. Is this just another sort of canary in the mine?
I'd be a little bit worried, to be honest, and I have been a little bit worried about tennis's global standing for a period. I think there's been some kind of rogue business decisions in terms of TV rights that haven't really helped the situation, particularly in the UK. But there's just certain markets where, US being probably the main one that I'm alluding to here, where it slips badly down the rankings, and it's losing a lot of kind of main channel visibility, which is never a great situation for any sport to be in. So yeah, I'm a little bit worried, and I think, but on the other hand, there is a kind of natural recycling sometimes within eras in sports, and when you lose people like Federer, Serena, and actually wasn't there last year, but still a big name to have retired. Barty, obviously from the Australian perspective, even as much as it'll pain Calvin's ears to hear it, even losing Kyrgios, who does bring in some numbers for the first few rounds. I'm not saying he's going to get in the final or whatever. That's not really a great tournament from an Australian perspective. So yeah, not ideal. I'm certainly not putting the nails in tennis's coffins, but I think, as we've said on this podcast from many times over the last however long we've been doing this, there were a lot of quite poor business decisions happening in the tennis world, and a lot of them really center around visibility of the sport. And I think there's a worry that might start coming home to roost quite badly in the not too distant future if we're not careful.
Calvin, I appreciate you've only been there a couple of days, and as you mentioned, have barely escaped from hotel and tennis centre, but you're in the US, and someone was trying to tell me on Twitter that the US is not the biggest market anymore, and it doesn't matter. There's a shift going on to European nations like Poland, and I was like, well, I appreciate there are a lot of people in Poland. There are a lot more of them in America. There's still a lot of money in America, and for advertisers and broadcasters, America is still the golden goose. Do you have any sense of what tennis's image is like in America, whether it really has much of a chance of kicking a recovery behind all these men that are breaking into the top 10?
Well, actually, the tournament that we're at this week, the main stadium seats 2,500, I think. And there's a gentleman who was talking to us the other day from the venue, and he said it was already a sellout. They'd already sold all the tickets for the week. He also told us that last year was a sellout, and that it was also a sellout for qualies as well. And there were 2,000, well, almost sellout for qualies. He said there were 2,000 people in for qualifying last year. Now, it's been qualifying the last 2 days, and there's been about 100 people in. So I don't know whether he had some sort of strange memory or what, but I did. Now, look, that wouldn't be uncommon for qualies. I don't think they're charging people. I don't think they're charging people, but it seems a big event. There's people watching the practice and that kind of thing, So, but he taught. I'll be interested to see. I'm getting to this. I'll be interested to see how it pans out the next few days, because this guy told me that tennis is huge in Dallas. He said it has a big following and they love it. I also spoke to a lad here who was, one of the lads who was sat with me when I was talking to this guy, said he's lived in Dallas for 5 years and no one's ever spoke to him about tennis. So again, let's see how the week pans out. Could be anything. Yeah, I mean, what I was told a couple of years ago on the visibility and the TV rights and this kind of thing is that tennis always does better in countries when it is on the same channel as golf, because apparently the people who watch golf also like to watch tennis, and golf is huge. Golf has a big viewership. And what happens is that, especially in stuff like Britain, in places like Britain where you pay for, like, a platform tends to have the rights for something.
Yeah.
And that's where tennis went off, when Sky Sports tends to have most of the golf. I think I've gone off watching golf, so I assume it still does. And then the tennis went away from that. It hasn't had tennis, so the women's went to BT, and the men's went to Amazon. And I think they lost a lot of viewership in that. And the same, apparently, it's very much the case in America, that when the tennis is on the same channel as the golf, more people watch it.
That's really interesting.
They said that, and then the person who told that works with a lot of sports as well, that they like to pair their sports up in terms of, so if you watch one sport, you tend to watch another sport as well. But I think what has happened is that even with that kind of knowledge and research, tennis has just gone, we don't care, we'll just go to whoever gives us the most money.
Yeah, there's a feeling of that, and ESPN have just signed up for a big new deal that this, I think, is the first year of, and they've just bombed it in terms of ratings. So that, I mean, look, it doesn't help that the final, I think, kicked off at 12:30 a.m. Eastern and 3:30 a.m. Pacific, or the other way around. I'm afraid that given that this podcast currently spans 3 time zones, and I'm also working in 2 others, I have no idea which way around that is. But the point is, it was overnight in the US, and that makes it hard. But it's always been overnight in the US. The Australian Open final has started at the same time for as long as, I don't know how long, but as long as I can remember. So when you're comparing apples with apples in that sense, it doesn't make a difference. Now, okay, the one last year went very long, which helped, so you pick up some like peak ratings in the morning when people are waking up, but I think people are too keen, specifically people who think that this is a slight against Novak Djokovic, like, are too keen to defend it and say, oh no, but it doesn't matter, or because of this or that. It's like, well, no, like, you have to accept that these numbers exist and ask questions as to why it's happening, rather than try and ask questions as to why it might be actually a bit of a mislead. Like, tennis is less popular, sport is less popular, esports is more popular, there is more competition, and you need to understand that tennis has to do something. And if fans sit down and say, oh no, we'll just accept tennis getting a bit less popular, then where are we going to go? We're not going to move. People aren't going to move the goalposts themselves.
Just to slightly defend tennis in the US, I mean, participation is quite on the rise there, even though you'll hear a lot of people going on about pickleball. People are picking up rackets a lot more there. But yeah, let's not go into that. We're not the pickleball podcast. But I also want to just signpost you to one of the more humorous comments I saw about this all this week, was someone saying, oh, don't care about the American market. Look at the Chinese one. 40% more people are watching tennis in China right now than ever before. I was like, tennis has literally banned itself from China. This doesn't feel like a very good strategy at the moment. If that's where we're going in the long run, so I wouldn't necessarily.
Well, yeah, I mean, they literally
praying China's going to save you.
Like, also, are we trusting any figures that come out of China?
Yeah, that's actually a very good point.
Or on Twitter, which is where I got it from. But I was just merely.
Oh no, that came from the Tennis Australia press release.
I did it.
Yeah, but that equally, there's absolutely no reason to believe that. Their attendance figures this year were proper like Arsenal home attendance figures, which for people who don't follow football in the UK are just total nonsense. You can see that half the stadium is empty, and they'll be like, and it's another capacity crowd. It's not.
I think the other thing I would say as well, you know, participation, okay, is doing fine, you might say. Ticket sales are also doing fine for kind of main events, but there's a big, broader problem that you'll see on the tour events, and just kind of, you know, in terms of the funding of the tour. Like, I think individual events is a good day out. People will go if it comes to that city on the whole. WTA finals last year aside, but you know, broadly speaking, tennis events can get people going to them if you're in a good kind of city. So there's that interest in a day out. And I've watched it for a long time. I don't meet many people who know what's going on in tennis outside of the Grand Slams. And I don't know many people who know much about what's going on in tennis outside about kind of 5 people in the world. And that kind of, you know, that's all very anecdotal. But, you know, it isn't, the visibility is not there in the kind of national sporting discourse, which, you know, the media does play some role in as well, and frankly, it doesn't get the column inches like a cricket or a rugby gets in this country.
I think another problem is with it as well, and this isn't a criticism of Swiatek and Djokovic, but they're the two best players in the world now, and people who aren't their biggest supporters. So I'm not talking about the Novak Djokovic obsessives and that kind of thing, and who don't really pay attention to tennis. They just don't really have strong opinions on those players. They haven't sort of got a natural charisma that draws people in. And I'm talking about this from the kind of thing that Federer had, and probably to a slightly lesser degree Nadal, and back when Agassi was playing. You would get people who would, if Agassi was playing a tennis match and you were flicking channels, you'd stay on it. You'd keep watching. Djokovic, as brilliant as he is, and he's unquestionably brilliant, maybe the best player that's ever played, I'm not sure that if you don't follow tennis and if you don't really care about those players that you're sticking on for Djokovic or Swiatek playing.
I think the really funny thing about Djokovic in this situation is there's never been a time where Djokovic has evoked more feelings from the general public than kind of right now. Like, but
they're not based around his tennis, though, George.
No, well, this is it. That's exactly what I was going to say. I mean, there's a bit of a saying in kind of sports journalism as a whole, is that you just want someone to make you feel something, whether that's good or bad. It doesn't really matter. And Djokovic is definitely, he's in that camp. But as you rightly say, how many people is that turning them into wanting to watch a Djokovic match or follow that, or that there's kind of it's putting eyes on tennis in terms of big stories. And tennis, for all its faults, has had some great stories in inverted commas over the last kind of 5 years where you're like, holy crap, that really got people talking in ways that, to be honest, things like rugby don't, in terms of that kind of crossover of like broader society, for example. So yeah, it is quite interesting. But as you say, the charisma's not there. We said it before, haven't we? I mean, Alcaraz has got a bit of that charisma to him in terms of his playing style, and that's a shoot of hope, perhaps. But you need to get him to be visible in the first place, because I'm not sure that many people are talking about him outside of our lovely tennis bubble, to be honest, at the moment.
Yeah, quite possibly. Right.
What a downer to end on.
I know. Have you got any other business?
No, I don't think so.
I broke my string quite impressively this week. It wasn't as bad as Calvin's racket break, but it was quite.
How did you do it? I mean, as someone who's never broken a string in his life.
Just hit the ball quite hard, didn't it?
The area where George broke his string would suggest that he wasn't hitting the ball that hard. He was hitting the ball wrong.
Actually, should I tell you what it was, Calvin? I think more embarrassingly is I'm not actually sure I broke it on the ball. I possibly broke it on the floor. I was sprinting for a volley going forward, and I caught it at a horrible angle into the floor. And I thought I might have snapped the frame at first. And just got the string. Yeah,
that was a terrible string break, that, George.
Terrible string break. Yeah. I've also managed to break my lat again, so really good times all around. The injuries.
Your lat?
Well, it's not like actually broken, but I've had
George is gesturing underneath his armpit for people who aren't on the
Zoom. It's under the armpit, but the thing is a broader kind of back problem. It's just can't catch a break. But at least my knee's okay. So
probably stop playing sport. That is all we've got time for because if George starts talking about all his injuries, then we really are going to run out of time. This has been Tennis Unfiltered. Please do leave us a rating or a review. Thank you very much for the 2 people who gave us a cowboy review this week, but it wasn't 5. But we'll try and get a cowboy hat on Calvin soon. Most importantly, please do come back next week.
Sports Social Podcast Network.